Good afternoon, BookTube. You join me once again for yet another video. This time I will be talking, as I have promised, about my recent reading of the poems of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. As you can see here, the copy of Coleridge which I am holding up is a penguin paperback that someone has kindly reinforced with a plastic covering. I did actually, if I recall, purchase this used on Amazon, and it's one of the old penguins. So as you can see, it's yellow, not black. I personally prefer the black ones, but these aren't so bad to look at either. And you have this gorgeous painting on the front cover. It's by a painter called John Sell Cotman, A Shady Pool by John Sell Cotman. And you can see the glorious body of water there, reflecting the trees and the surrounding shrubbery, and the glorious cerulean sky as well in the background. And all of that is, of course, very appropriate for a poet like Coleridge, who, like his great pal, Wordsworth, was a nature poet. He was very much a poet who loved to write about the natural world, about the sights and sounds of the natural world, of the countryside. He loved to write about the tweeting and chirping of the birds and the babbling of the brooks and the joys of just being in nature and being in awe of the natural beauty that humanity has been blessed with on this planet. So if you are into that sort of stuff, and I like that sort of stuff in doses, not to excess, then I highly recommend Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now, I am much more familiar with Wordsworth's work, and a large part of that is down to the fact that earlier this year I made my way through all of my penguin copy of his selected poems, which had been lying on my shelf for many years, practically untouched. And having recently read the lyrical ballads, which, of course, was the product of a joint effort of both Wordsworth and Coleridge, I felt that it behooved me to actually read Coleridge as well, not just as part of a collaborative effort, but on his own. Because if you read the lyrical ballads, with the exception of Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which is very much stamped with Coleridge's singular imprint, all the other poems are difficult, really, to distinguish in terms of the style. You can't really put your finger on what makes Wordsworth different from Coleridge. And that is obviously one of the reasons why Wordsworth was uncomfortable with the fact that the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner was published in the original edition of the lyrical ballads, and he actually wanted later editions to take that out because it rather disrupted the homogeneous feel that Wordsworth was going for with the rest of the poems that the two worked on. So I felt that it was incumbent upon me to actually look at Coleridge as a poet in his own right, rather than as someone who was Wordsworth's sidekick. Now, as well as being one half of the greatest literary bromance in English history, Coleridge was a prolific poet in his own right, and all of the poems that he wrote in his lifetime are gathered here, to my knowledge. The editor actually makes the point that a lot of the poems in here weren't actually included in Coleridge's own version of his own complete poems. And there are various reasons, no doubt, for those editorial decisions on the part of Coleridge, but as people who are students of Romantic poetry, it's obviously something that is useful if we can get all of the poems he ever wrote in one place. Obviously, not everyone is going to be a Coleridge fanatic or a scholar of Romantic poetry, But those of us who have a deep interest in it, and I count myself as one of them, I think we are very well served by having all of his poems in one book. Now, I have to confess that I've been struggling with Coleridge. I am just much more used to Wordsworth's style. I like Wordsworth a lot more. I feel when I'm reading him that there's just an earnestness there, an earnestness and also a degree of wisdom that I'm not yet getting from Coleridge. And a large part of that is because this book is arranged chronologically. So I am reading his earliest poems. I'm still a quarter of the way through, more or less, and I'm still very much on his early poems, which obviously aren't going to be as good as some of the later stuff he wrote. I mean, we're still some way away from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which appears later in this collection, and which I've already read, and of which there are actually more than there's actually more than one edition of it. Because Coleridge, like his pal Wordsworth, was obsessed with touching up his poems after he'd already written them. And I have mixed views about whether or not that is something which artists should do. They are by no means the only artists who have done that. It does smack of control freakery, this idea that they were desperate to control how their work was received by posterity, so much so that they could not resist the temptation to make these endless redrafts and edits and emendations. And I have mixed views about that. I mean, it does make things a bit annoying as a reader if you're a completist and you want to read every single thing they ever wrote. Then the pressure is on you to read every single version of every poem they ever wrote, which just gives you more work, really. So I have mixed views about that. But going back to the topic, I'm having trouble with Coleridge. I'm not warming to him as much as I warmed to Wordsworth when I read him earlier this year, this spring. And again, as I've said before, a large part of that is the fact that Coleridge, in these early works, he is very immature, like all young men, and that comes across in the poems. There's a lot of saccharine sentimentality, a lot of syrupy, lachrymose, emotionally manipulative stuff, which frankly leaves me cold. There are a few poems in here about his wife Sarah and their relationship, which, if you know the history, wasn't actually the healthiest or the happiest marriage in literary history, and that is probably belied. That is something which is arguably contradicted by the way in which he writes about her in these poems. So again, I guess it's another reason why I'm not quite warming to him. He doesn't feel earnest a lot of the time. I can't always tell if he's being honest in the way in which he is conveying these effusions, these outpourings of emotion, or whether he's just doing a typically romantic thing and play acting at emotion, simulating emotion that he doesn't actually feel. And that mirrors a lot of the criticisms that Nietzsche in particular made about the Romantics later in the 19th century, when he was attacking Wagner and the disciples of Wagner and the Romantic movement in general. He identified a lot of this attitude on the part of the Romantics, that they were just obsessed with simulating emotion and manipulating their audience rather than truthfully conveying what they actually felt. So I think the romantic fetishization of the emotions and the emphasis that the Romantics put on the emotions in their poetry is, in the case of Coleridge, something which is uh, leaving me rather cold. Which is funny because I love Wordsworth, I love Byron, but when it comes to Coleridge and even Keats's early work, I just find that it's too much emotion. It's saccharine, it's unconvincing, it's overblown, it's very windy, very adolescent, very infantile. and I am struggling with that kind of approach. But I am confident that as I get through this poetry collection, I will get to the good stuff, I'll get to the better poetry, and I will have more of an appreciation for Coleridge as a poet, and probably a more complete, more holistic view on him than I do of Wordsworth, because I've only read the best Wordsworth. Apart from the selected poems, I've also read the lyrical ballads. So I've read the best of his poetry. I've not read the really early stuff, or the really late stuff, which, if scholars are to be believed, isn't very good. So, without further ado, I think we should go into the poetry itself, and I can talk a bit more in terms of the specifics of why so much of Coleridge's early stuff is leaving me so cold. The first poem I would like to talk about is a poem he wrote early on in his career called The Destiny of Nations. The Destiny of Nations. So this is actually a poem that he co-wrote with Bob Southey, who he was good friends with. They later had a falling out, a dispute over the formation of this utopian society that they wanted to set up called pantisocracy, which never got off the ground, and which is probably just as well. Like so many of these romantic poets, Coleridge was obsessed with political radicalism. He, like Wordsworth and many others, celebrated the French Revolution, and although he became a massive reactionary in later life, I think that this youthful celebration of the French Revolution is something which very much remains at the center of how he and so many other romantic poets are received today. If you read a lot of the poetry, and even the best poetry, of these romantic poets, it was suffused very much with the spirit of revolution. So this is a poem ostensibly about Joan of Arc, although if you are a student of history, which I am, you will suss out the more contemporary allusions that are made in this poem. And there's a particular scene which I just had to underline as an exemplar of how emotionally manipulative I find Coleridge to be so much of the time. So in this scene, we are presented with Joan of Arc, the maid. She's wandering through the countryside, and she stumbles across this poor family who are starving, who are suffering from the cold. They are clearly dying, and we'll see how Coleridge describes Joan of Arc's discovery in these lines. She, meantime, saw crowded close beneath the coverture a mother and her children, lifeless all, yet lovely. Not a lineament was marred. Death had put on so slumber-like a form. It was a piteous sight, and one, a babe, the crisp milk frozen on its innocent lips, lay on the woman's arm, its little hand stretched on her bosom. Now, you can see that Coleridge is milking that scene for all it is worth. This distressing imagery of the crisp milk frozen on the innocent lips of this dead baby, this ridiculous, saccharine image we are given, completely unrealistic, of these dead corpses, which nevertheless manage to look so lovely and so pretty, and are described in such loving detail, as if we were looking at some painting. I mean, this is romanticism all over. I mean, this is the romanticization of death, and the romanticization also of the lower classes, because the people who have died in this scene are clearly meant to be starving peasants. And I actually read this as an allusion to events in France at the time, and as a statement of Coleridge's own political sympathies. This idea that the revolutionaries in France were out to bring down tyranny and end the suffering of the peasantry under the hands of the oppressive Ancien Regime. So that's just an example of how I think Coleridge's art in these early years is really incredibly overblown, very manipulative, very unconvincing stuff, and frankly quite cheap as well. Now, I did get to a poem I did like, and this is actually the poem that comes just after The Destiny of Nations. It was written shortly after, the same year, I believe. It's called Religious Musings, and in it, Coleridge is waxing lyrical on his religious worldview. He was the son of a pastor, so it makes sense that this was something that he was obsessed with, not just in his youth, but throughout his life. So much so that towards the end of his life, he became utterly obsessed with defending the Church of England as an elderly reactionary and conservative who had repudiated his former views, and he became a champion of abstruse German philosophy at the same time as he was nursing a serious drug addiction. So that shows you a lot about the somewhat scatterbrained nature of this man. I actually found the first few pages of this poem rather dull, and I didn't see how I was going to get through it. But then I came to the latter part of the poem, which I think is the rhetorical high point of this poem, and I think it deserves to be seen as probably his first very high quality piece of work. And once you get past a lot of the high-flown rhetoric, a lot of the rather dull philosophical stuff, there is, towards the latter part of the poem, this incredibly powerful apocalyptic imagery of the kind which, whether you sympathize with his political views, and I don't, and whether or not you agree at all with his celebration of revolution and of revolutionary violence, you have to agree that the language that he uses here is incredibly artful. The way in which he creates this scene of apocalypse, the way in which he stretches his still very much raw poetic craft to its very limits here, and to create this apocalyptic image for the reader is impressive, and I'm going to read an excerpt to you. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to start from roughly line 200, or just before line 200. In the primeval age, a dateless while, the vacant shepherd wandered with his flock, pitching his tent where'er the green grass waved. But soon imagination conjured up a host of new desires. With busy aim, each for himself, earth's eager children toiled. So property began, twice streaming fount, whence vice and virtue flow, honey and gold. Hence the soft couch, and many-coloured robe, the timbrel, and arched dome, and costly feast, with all the inventive arts that nursed the soul to forms of beauty, and by sensual wants unsensualized the mind, which in the means learnt to forget the grossness of the end, best pleasured with its own activity, and hence disease that withers manhood's arm, the daggered envy, spirit-quenching want, warriors and lords and priests, all the sore ills that vex and desolate our mortal life, wide wasting ills, yet each the immediate source of mightier good. Their keen necessities to ceaseless action goading human thought hath made earth's reasoning animal her lord, and the pale-featured sage's trembling hand, strong as a host of armoured deities, such as the blind Ionian fabled erst. So there you can see that Coleridge is restating, in that rather powerful poetry, this Rousseauan idea that we start off in this state of nature, we start off pure, uncorrupted, living simple, carefree lives, like this shepherd here, and then we discover property, and we begin to form civilized societies in which wealth and class divisions and materialism and all of the things we associate with living in society, all of the corrupting influences of society, now come into being and destroy this simple, this pure, uncorrupted life that we enjoyed before. So again, this is very Rousseauan. This is very romantic. And what I found interesting is that even as he is giving us this rather unflattering image of modern society, he does acknowledge, much like Karl Marx did later on, the benefits of this society, that it has given a massive spur to the forces of science and reason, begrudging acknowledgement by this romantic poet that the Enlightenment did do some good after all. But then we come to the more apocalyptic imagery, in which he prophesies the rising of the lower classes, who are shut out from enjoying this prosperity. These on the fated day, when, stung to rage by pity, eloquent men have roused with pealing voice the unnumbered tribes that toil and groan and bleed, hungry and blind. These hushed awhile, with patient eyes serene, shall watch the mad careering of the storm. Then o'er the wild and wavy chaos rush and tame the outrageous mass, with plastic bite moulding confusion to such perfect forms as erst were wont. Bright visions of the day to float before them, when, the summer noon, beneath some arched romantic rock reclined, they felt the sea breeze lift their youthful locks. So again, I actually wrote here, you probably won't be able to see this, I wrote demagoguery, because that's what Coleridge is doing. He is being a demagogue. He's doing it in beautiful poetic language, but he is nevertheless being a demagogue in his justification of violent revolution. He presents this vision of these philosophers and poets rousing the masses to action, rousing them to revolutionary violence and vengeance on their enemies. And there's more of this, actually. There is more. Yes, I will quote from this at length, because it deserves to be quoted, just as an insight into his mindset. Rest awhile, children of wretchedness. More groans must rise, more blood must stream, or ere your wrongs be full. Yet is the day of retribution nigh. The Lamb of God hath opened the fifth seal, and upward rush on swiftest wing of fire the innumerable multitudes of wrongs by man on man inflicted. Rest awhile, children of wretchedness. We see that repetition of that line, that phrase, children of wretchedness. The hour is nigh, and lo, the great, the rich, the mighty men, the kings, and the chief captains of the world, with all that fixed on high like stars of heaven, shut baleful influence, shall be cast to earth, vile and downtrodden, as the untimely fruit shook from the fig tree by a sudden storm. Even now the storm begins, each gentle name, faith and meek piety, with fearful joy tremble far off. For lo, the giant frenzy, uprooting empires, with his whirlwind arm, mocketh high heaven, burst hideous from the cell where the old hag, unconquerable, huge, creation's eyeless drudge, black ruin, sits nursing the impatient earthquake. So again, we see this extraordinary, biblical, apocalyptic language, eschatological language, actually. And I actually wrote in here, next to the verse, the rhetorical high point of the poem. I wrote play, actually, by mistake. I meant poem. I still have Shakespeare on the brain. But, I mean, this is incredibly exciting apocalyptic imagery, and it really captures the way in which Coleridge and so many of his contemporaries felt during this time. They felt that the world was being turned upside down, that this was the chance to begin society again. And you see a fusion, really, of this religious idea with political radicalism. And as we know, it would all end in tears, as revolutions invariably do, and Coleridge would learn that the hard way. But I think that this really is a turning point in terms of my experience with this poetry collection, because until recently I was struggling with Coleridge, and I wasn't particularly enjoying a lot of this early stuff. But now we are getting to the good stuff, so I'm hopeful, and I think as I go on in this collection, I will get to more and more of this kind of quality, and of course, even better than that. So I think that is all I have to say. Uh, Thank you for watching. If you have any other poets that you think I should read and talk about on this channel, do feel free to comment. But that is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Complete Poems. I'm still working my way through it, and I hope to be back soon with an update on how I'm finding it. Signing off for now.